From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. When MPs are summoned to Parliament on a Saturday, you know it's serious. On what should have been a sleepy spring weekend, Westminster was suddenly abuzz, with MPs taking selfies outside Parliament just to prove they'd been there for a rare and historic emergency session. Parliament had been recalled in a matter of hours in middle of the Easter recess to try and save one of the last steel-making plants in the country, as, in a race against time, one of their 2 remaining furnaces was about to go out. Attention suddenly focused on the plant in North Lincolnshire.
Scunthorpe's a very big site. It's got about 40 kilometres of internal railway. You could even take a rail tour around it. There's a company that just runs little locomotives in the weekend around the internal railway. Traditional steel plants, of which Scunthorpe is one, are big industrial sites, the kind of thing that you associate in your mind's eye when you think of an industrial landscape. They're miles long. It's a pale shadow of what it was, though. It's still, physically very big, geographically very big. I think at its height, Scunthorpe had something like 35 blast furnaces of different sizes, and now it's down to 2. And of course, it's blast furnaces which are occupying the government at the moment, the future of the blast furnaces at Scunthorpe.
The government is now in control of the Scunthorpe plant for the first time since the 1980s. But how did we get here? How did we come so close to the end of British steelmaking? And for the Chinese company that owns British Steel, was this a simple business calculation? Or, as some politicians have suggested, something more sinister?
This was an attempt at what I think is best described as industrial sabotage. And I'm glad that eventually the government called them out.
The story today: British Steel, Chinese sabotage, or self-sabotage?
I'm Dominic O'Connell. I'm the Times Radio business correspondent.
Dom, it felt like almost out of nowhere if you weren't tracking this on a daily basis. There was suddenly a lot of concern over the weekend about a steel plant in Scunthorpe. What happened?
What happened was that the last 2 traditional blast furnaces operating in the UK were at risk of closure. This is not big news in the sense that the owner of the site, Jingye, which is a Chinese company, has warned everybody, really, that it planned to close the blast furnaces going back a couple of years, really, saying that it couldn't make money from traditional steelmaking in the UK. So Jingye had been warning for some time that these blast furnaces were likely to close. A fortnight ago, it said, OK, we are going to close them. We intend to close them either early in June or early in September. We're still working out which of the 2 it will be. But it became apparent, and certainly the government appears to have learnt, that actually one of the 2 would be either closed completely or idled as soon as Monday, so the 14th of April, which was much sooner than anybody had expected. And that prompted something of a crisis in the government, who ended up recalling Parliament to approve some emergency legislation.
Order! Order! We now come to motion number 1 on the Steel Industry Special Measures Bill of the House. I call the Minister to move. The Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
I think only the 6th time that's happened since the Second World War.
We meet in these special circumstances because the government needs to act decisively, at pace and with urgency to ensure that the steelworks blast furnaces of British Steel are maintained and kept going, saving thousands of jobs and securing our domestic production of virgin steel.
to allow the government, or at least allow the Secretary of State for Business, Jonathan Reynolds, almost complete control over any steel undertaking. It gives him very wide powers to direct the management of, in this case, British Steel, but any steel undertaking, to do whatever he says, really, or whatever the Secretary of State says. These really are sweeping powers. If you defy an order, if Jingye, for example, told the Secretary of State to sod off, the management could be imprisoned for up to 2 years and or fined. So the Secretary of State is now running it, and the efforts that are happening at the moment are to try and ensure that the first of the 2 blast furnaces there is not taken out of commission immediately.
So, Dom, I mean, this really is very radical in terms of government intervention. Before we go on to why they've done it and what exactly was at risk, I suppose it would help just to explain a bit about British Steel. I mean, how big is that now? Is this one of the only plants they run?
Well, when people talk about British Steel, in their mind's eye, they tend to have the idea of what was British Steel, the old once government-owned company, then privatised company, was privatised in 1988, which was, in essence, the entire UK steel industry. Just about every single steel facility in the UK went into British Steel. The current British Steel, the reincarnation of British Steel, is only a small sliver of that. It's only the Scunthorpe Works, plus a few associated bits and pieces here and there, mainly in Yorkshire. So that is what we're talking about. British Steel, a small remnant of what was the old British Steel.
And a Chinese company had actually come to own this sliver, this little company, British Steel, this plant. To explain why the government has stepped in, you said they realised one of these blast furnaces was going to be effectively decommissioned as soon as this Monday. Just explain how that works. What exactly is a blast furnace?
A blast furnace is a big, tall column. From the outside, it just looks like a rather large steel drum with gantries and walkways going around it. Probably 200 or 300 feet tall, 100 maybe not 100 metres tall, 70 metres tall, something like that for an average blast furnace. And these blast furnaces make steel from its raw components, iron ore and coke, which is a reduced form of coal. And the blast bit of it is an innovation that the British invented in the 1820s, 1830s, where rather than just having an ordinary furnace, and iron has been made from furnaces like this going back thousands of years, literally thousands of years, but the blast bit is that you blast air into it to improve the efficiency of it and the economics of the furnace. Blast furnaces, despite their size and, rugged construction, are quite delicate beasts. So if you're going to bring down a blast furnace, you have to do it very carefully. If you're doing it quickly, it can be quite a tricky process and not one that's guaranteed of success. So we assume, although the government has never quite spelt it out, that they were fearful that it was going to be closed quickly, that it might have been closed in a way that meant it wouldn't be able to be brought back up, and that the UK would lose one of these 2 blast furnaces.
In terms of the company itself, this Chinese firm, why did they suddenly find themselves in a position where this furnace was about to go out?
Well, they had warned for some time that they were losing money. The steel companies in the UK struggle because we have high energy costs. We have high carbon costs. You have to pay for the carbon you emit, and these things do emit a lot of carbon dioxide. And also they don't have the big advantage that a lot of the very large steel works where the world steel industry has concentrated in China, in Kazakhstan, in India in particular, where they have local captive sources of those raw materials, iron ore and coke and coal. If you don't have those nearby and captive, i.e. part of your works, integrated into the supply chain, then you're at a big cost disadvantage. So in its last published accounts, which only came out last month, British Steel, that's owned by Jingye, said that it lost about £220 million in the year. And more recently, it's said that it's losing about £700,000 a day on its current operations. So perhaps an opportunity came to them to close it early, and they thought, actually, this is too good an opportunity to pass up.
Just talk us through how the Chinese came to own it. How much trouble has it been in?
Well, steelmaking in the UK has certainly in the past 2 or 3 decades been very boom and bust. British Steel was privatised in 1988. About 10 years later, just before the turn of the century, it bought or merged with a Dutch steel company called Hugevens. It immediately got into quite nasty trouble, actually, heavily loss-making. The shares went right down to about 2p at one stage. I remember writing about it at the time. But the steel cycle swung, it started to make quite a lot of money, and Tata bought it in 2007 for £6 billion. Subsequently, Tata decided that the Scunthorpe works, they didn't see a future for them at all, and they sold it on to a company called Greybull Capital, which is a financial investment firm. They made a fist of it for a couple of years, and then it went into administration in 2019. The government got involved, organised an auction, Jingye took over, and they similarly have limped along. They have invested some money. They've also lent a lot of money to cover the losses. But now they are, rather like Tata thought back when they first sold it, that actually they can't make money at Scunthorpe anymore. So for Jingye, it's been an expensive and ill-fated foray into the UK.
Dom, given that this hasn't been a productive plant for a very long time, were you surprised on Saturday watching Parliament reconvene, watching cross-party support for the idea of basically nationalising it?
Well, to me, the mystery about this is why the government has suddenly discovered a love for blast furnaces. The government has shown absolutely no interest in keeping blast furnaces open up until really the last couple of weeks. If you look back at the steel strategy, which has been consulted on quite recently. In fact, the consultation closed in March. The only reference to blast furnaces in the whole document is about how we get out of blast furnaces, how we transition from blast furnaces to greener forms of steel making. So this excitement about what's happening at British Steel, about those two blast furnaces at Scunthorpe, is a very recent development. And one of the questions that arises is that if British Steel is nationalised, as looks quite likely now, what is the government going to do with these two blast furnaces, given that its stated policy is to close them? So what's changed in the past couple of weeks that makes the government want to move heaven and earth to save two blast furnaces, which, by the way, it must be said, have absolutely marginal profitability at the best of times, which were built in 1954, and also along the way, say some rather unkind things about China, suggest that Jingye actually acted to sabotage its own assets, which is a kind of an interesting idea when you haven't shown any interest in those assets up until now. Why has there been this sudden change of heart by the government? Maybe the people who advise Labour and Labour themselves are thinking that actually our assessment of what is a sovereign capability and what is not needs to change. And that steelmaking, having been disdained for a long time and not thought worthy of attention or support, suddenly is. And it is rather curious that they're alighting on two of the oldest, least profitable, most marginal assets to do it with.
You mentioned some of the rhetoric around this has involved the word sabotage. We've heard politicians, we've heard MPs on all sides of the House describing what this company, Jingye, was doing as sabotage. Just explain what they mean by it, how they think a sabotage would have occurred, and what you make of whether it's possible.
The charge of sabotage really is based on two things. First, that Jingye was acting prematurely, to try and cut off the UK's ability to make virgin steel. And a second element to it could be that Jingye was trying to stop that ability to make steel in order to sell Chinese-made steel into the UK market. But I don't think either of those stand up to scrutiny, really, because the government has never said that the steel industry is a protected industry. It has no hold or condition on the assets that stops Jingye from enjoying them as it would enjoy any other kind of private property. So if Jingye wants to close the plant, I don't see why they're not free to do it. So I don't think that first charge holds up at all. And on the imports question, well, about 60%, probably this year 70% of the UK's steel use is imported anyway. So what is Jingye aiming for? Another couple of percent on imports? It's just a kind of a ridiculous assertion. I think the real reason that the sabotage point has been made is simply to distract people from the fact that Labour has really got itself into a bit of a mess with its policy on steelmaking and has discovered at the last minute that this is something it might want to save or might want to be seen to be saving, and it was a bit late to act.
Dom, you were explaining how people have been warning about the decline of the steel industry for years. This isn't a problem that has suddenly emerged in the last couple of weeks. If anything, it's been going for decades now. So just take us back to the start. When was boom time for steel in this country?
Well, boom time for steel in the UK was from the early 1700s right up until really just after the Second World War.
And so, by day and by night, in all the steel works of Britain, a constant stream of molten metal flows. Steel, created out of the coal, the limestone and the ore that are found inside our own land, or brought with special ores from abroad under the guns of the Royal Navy. Steel, made in a manner befitting a great tradition, by men who know their job.
The UK was the absolute world leader in steel. And, Sheffield and a large part of the Midlands, right across to Scunthorpe and Lincolnshire and North Yorkshire, was the Silicon Valley of its day. There were vast fortunes made in steel. The UK was very good at a lot of the technology associated with steel making, and it exported that technology right round the world. Tata Steel, for example, which is the big Indian steel maker, its company town and enormous associated steelworks at Jamshedpur, it was laid out, and the company town was laid out with the assistance of Sidney and Beatrice Webb, the two founders of the Fabian Society, the forerunner of the Labour Party. So there's an awful lot of British ingenuity in steel that went right round the world, to the US, of course. The US overtook Britain in steelmaking to be the world's biggest steelmaker in the 1850s. And since then, the UK has sort of gradually slipped down the ranks of steelmaking countries in the world as its domestic consumption has gone down. It's become a much more mature economy with much less need to build new railways and skyscrapers and stuff like that. But also it's gone down as other countries have become much more competitive, and high energy costs, lack of access to cheap and readily available raw materials, all those things have conspired to make UK steelmaking dwindle and go down and down. And now in terms of virgin steelmaking, we're left with just those two blast furnaces on the Scunthorpe site. There isn't much left of the British steel industry. British steel production last year was 5.6 million tonnes, which is the lowest level since the mid-1930s, when steel production was artificially depressed by the Great Depression. And it's been on a steady decline really since the mid-50s. Just for reference, China, for example, makes about 1 billion tonnes of steel a year. So the UK really is an absolute minnow when it comes to steel production. Steel has not been regarded as a strategic priority by any recent government, really. They've talked a lot about it, and lots of people have commented on it, saying that any modern industrial nation needs to be able to make steel itself. It's what they call a foundation industry. If you want to make cars, if you want to make tanks and other weapons, then you need a domestic steel industry. However, given how quickly the UK steel industry has declined and the relative lack of government support that would allow it to continue, then I don't think you can say that any government has regarded it as strategic. And certainly no recent government has made any move to try and protect it by, for example, taking a golden share in any of the companies, or by renationalising any of the companies, or even by doing anything by way of support in terms of energy prices or control of the cost of carbon emissions, anything like that, that would make you think that politicians think that steel is important. It's clear that they might talk about the importance of steel, but they've done nothing to support it. There are lots of steel plants that have been closed in the UK over the past few decades. Redcar up in the northeast of the country, Ravenscraig before that in Scotland. Very, very big steel works, bigger than the one that we're talking about now in Scunthorpe.
One of the big reasons does seem to be energy prices being so expensive in this country. When did that really begin to bite? And why has it got so much worse now?
Began to bite really in the middle years of the first decade of this century, so from 2005 onwards. The move towards having more renewable forms of energy did bump up prices because, of course, they required some subsidy when they were first started. And there was never really an attempt by the government to make sure that manufacturing industry, and particularly energy-intensive manufacturing industries, were protected from higher energy prices.
For the Labour Party now, in government, we know that growth is a really big part of their agenda. We also know that they're committed to net zero. As you've pointed out, that is pushing up energy prices, which is making it worse for things like the steel and the chemicals industries. How much are those two ambitions in contradiction? Are these two horses that they're trying to ride at the same time? Will they have to pick one?
I don't think they necessarily have to, because growth in the UK has done okay without manufacturing, really, for most of the past 30-odd years. At the end of the 1970s, manufacturing was about 25% of the UK economy. Now it's down to about 8%. And really, Britain's, well, not necessarily its future, but this has been the story of the past 30 years, is a shift from traditional manufacturing to services. And I think that if the government wants growth quickly, it's probably going to be looking to the services economy rather than manufacturing. But I do think this whole episode with British Steel does show that if they're suddenly taking an interest in what's left of virgin steelmaking in the UK, then maybe they are considering, with this post-Trump reset, what is really important and where might economic growth be coming from, and what balance do you need to that economic growth? I don't think Labour will abandon its net zero strategy piecemeal and say, OK, we're just going to go for cheaper energy to help turbocharge growth. But I think what they might do, though, is adopt some kind of subsidy measure which will allow big energy-intensive users like Scunthorpe, like chemicals plants, glass plants, some kind of protection from high energy prices. I'm not sure how they would structure it. I'm sure they could find a way. But I think it's more likely to be a carve-out for industrial users rather than some wholesale abandonment of net zero.
And just finally, Dom, one of the conversations that has come from this entire fiasco over the weekend, all the talk of sabotage has made a lot of people question whether we should be allowing the Chinese to own bits of infrastructure or key bits of industry. Is that something we should be worried about? Is that an argument that you think is going to continue?
Well, I think that is a very interesting question. And, the idea of what is sovereign capability, what a strategic capability you need to keep does seem to change from government to government and decade to decade, really, because the wave of Chinese investment we had was really the product of a rapprochement led by George Osborne as Chancellor in that Conservative government. His idea was that China was the second biggest economy in the world. He had a personal closeness to China, and he said, we needed to get alongside the Chinese. That led to significant investment in the new nuclear program from China. Let's not forget, by the way, the CGN, the main Chinese nuclear power company, still has an option to build a new nuclear power station at Bradwell in Essex, about 50 miles from the centre of London. So when it comes to possible sovereign capability and vulnerability, I suspect that's probably number one on the list. That project seems to be in abeyance at the moment. But there's all kinds of Chinese investment in the UK. But now we seem to think that China is more of the enemy than it was before. We don't need to be alongside it. But the idea you're suddenly going to undo all these investments, if the government were to do that, well, the Chinese investors own Northumbrian Water, for example. They own a lot of the regional electricity distribution grids in the UK. They are minority shareholders in Heathrow Airport. It's a very, very long list. So trying to undo these very long-term investments when political fashion changes, it's very difficult. You can change your ideas very quickly, but actually getting out of bricks and mortar is very hard.
That was the Times Radio business correspondent Dominic O'Connell. You can find all the latest on British Steel on Times Radio or online at thetimes.com. This episode was produced by Taryn Siegel. The executive producer was Molly Guinness. Sound design and theme composition were by Malasetto. If you have any thoughts on what you've just heard, or if you want to get in touch about any other episode, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.